a button found beneath the piano stool, and with it, the first note of a deadly tune. Welcome to Tea and Clue. I'm your host, Elias Thorne. Join the mystery. Drop your location in the comments. I treasure every message you leave. Let's begin. On the third Saturday of June, the village of Chipping Darnley prepared itself for its most anticipated annual occasion, the summer recital at the Vicarage Hall. No one expected musical excellence, of course. That was never the point. The recital was an excuse for polished shoes, lemon drizzle cake, and quiet gossip behind polite applause. The music was merely a respectable backdrop. Much like the faded blue velvet curtains that framed the small stage and the slightly out-of-tune grand piano donated by the late Mrs. Ellington in 1943, which no one dared replace out of sheer tradition. By 6 o'clock, the front rows were occupied by the usual mixture of earnest parishioners and vaguely competitive amateur musicians. Colonel Weatherby had already begun distributing his wine gums with military precision. Young Rosamond Trent was adjusting her peacock feather hat to angle more favorably toward the vicar's son, and Miss Lavinia Marsh, 48, sharp-nosed, unmarried, and fiercely musical, was muttering about someone having moved the candelabra from the piano top. Behind the stage, nervous energy trembled in the corridors. There were whispers about damp sheet music, missing bows, and an odd rattling inside the piano that Mr. Felix Hepplethwaite, the local choir master, had declared a minor nuisance, not worth investigating now. Mr. Hepplethwaite was to perform last, a self-composed meditation for evening shadows, which he had described several times as tonally ambitious. But it was during the second performance, a rather hesitant rendition of Claire de Lune by 14-year-old Celia Winthrop, that the air changed. Celia, to her credit, was doing her best. Her small frame hunched over the keys, brows furrowed, she struck the familiar notes with a mixture of reverence and nervousness. The audience, perhaps lulled by the dreamy melody or simply digesting their second slice of Victoria sponge, hardly noticed when a soft, unnatural thud issued from beneath the piano. Celia faltered for half a beat, then continued bravely. Miss Marple, seated in the back row near the aisle, her preferred vantage point, tilted her head slightly. She had heard the sound distinctly. It was not a pedal or a shift of posture. It was heavier, like a dropped shoe or something falling from a hiding place. She adjusted her gloves, her expression mild, and resumed her quiet observation of the hall. When Celia finished, there was polite clapping, then shifting, then a hushed murmur from the stage. Mr. Hepplethwaite had gone to inspect the pedals, frowning, and crouched down beside the bench. The audience stilled. There was an exchange of whispers. Lavinia Marsh stood up, clutching her handbag like a broadsword. Hepplethwaite emerged pale and stood, holding something in his gloved hand, a round, brass button, slightly tarnished with a deep red thread still attached to it. Was this from someone's coat? He asked into the hush, but no one answered. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, watching as the vicar stepped up beside Hepplethwaite, his mouth drawn tight. "I do hope," said Miss Lavinia Marsh loudly, "this won't delay things unnecessarily. We've only the duet left." But the duet was never played. 10 minutes later, the hall was emptied. Constable Darnley had been summoned. The piano was cordoned off with a tea towel and 2 music stands, and it was Miss Marple, unhurried, unnoticed, unimportant to the general flurry, who walked once around the piano, her eyes grazing the polished wood, pausing near the piano stool where the button had fallen. She did not touch it, she did not speak, but she thought, quite clearly, that button never belonged to a musician's jacket, and it was never meant to be found tonight. A subtle, unsettling energy began to hum beneath the surface of Chipping Darnley, one that had nothing to do with music. For while the recital had ended early, the performance of human nature had only just begun. Constable Darnley arrived with a great show of briskness and buttoned pockets, his bicycle still ticking as he wheeled it to a stop outside the vicarage hall. He was a tall, sandy-haired man with a well-meaning expression and a faint smell of mothballs, made slightly more conspicuous by the fact that his uniform trousers were perpetually 1 inch too short. He had been summoned on occasions far less mysterious than this. Loose sheep, missing tins of biscuits, and once, quite alarmingly, a hedgehog in the rectory larder. But a brass button beneath a piano was something new. Not exactly a crime, of course, but still, one had to be thorough. "I understand," he said, notebook in hand, "that it dropped during the recital." The vicar, the Reverend Thomas Pemble, nodded gravely. "It made a rather loud sound during young Celia's performance. Mr. Heplethwaite found it under the piano. No one has claimed it." "It could be nothing," the constable said, peering at the button in the little glass dish where it had been laid for inspection. "Off someone's jacket, most likely." "Except," Miss Lavinia Marsh interjected with the practiced certainty of someone who had always known better, "that no one here was wearing anything with buttons like that. It's far too large and garish. Not local tailoring, I should think." Miss Marple, seated quietly just behind the vicar's wife, kept her expression smooth. She had seen buttons like that before, years ago, on a walking coat worn by a man who was not what he claimed to be. Brass was flashy. The deep red thread was not ordinary. It had meant something to someone, and she had a notion that it still did. Constable Darnley, in an effort to appear official, declared that he would ask for everyone's details and if anyone had seen a coat missing a button. There was an embarrassed pause, followed by vague shaking of heads. No one had noticed anything of the sort. No one ever did, until it mattered. Miss Marple stood. "If I might make a small suggestion," she said mildly. "Perhaps it would be sensible to check that nothing else is beneath the piano." The sound the object made when it fell was not quite the sound a button alone would make, I think. The constable blinked. "You think there might be more?" "I only suggest it to be thorough," Miss Marple said. "I should be very pleased to be wrong." There was a pause. Mr. Heplethwaite looked rather alarmed, but Constable Darnley, slightly flushed, got down on one knee and peered again beneath the piano. He reached his arm deep inside the casing near the back foot, where the soundboard arched slightly. His face changed. "Well now," he said slowly, and withdrew something long and flat and wrapped in what looked like oilcloth. There was a general inhaling of breath. Even Miss Marsh did not speak. The object, once unwrapped, revealed itself to be a black, leather-bound ledger. Its cover bore no markings. The pages inside were stiff, dense with handwritten entries. Not music, not minutes of a parish committee, but names, dates, amounts. A few notes written in a firm, narrow hand. It was Miss Marple who observed, softly, "That's a betting ledger." Mr. Heplethwaite recoiled as though stung. "Impossible." "Not so impossible as all that," Miss Marple murmured. "I once saw one very much like it, years ago, when a cousin of mine in Gloucestershire had some trouble with his gamekeeper. It was kept hidden under a floorboard. People are always hiding things in floorboards, though I've never quite seen the appeal myself." Constable Darnley turned the pages carefully. "These are all local names. This one, Harold Penway. He runs the mill, doesn't he?" "Runs it into the ground," someone muttered. The room, which had begun the evening with lukewarm applause and fruitcake, was now tense with unease. Miss Marple, though still seated, felt the shift. The button had been a signal, whether dropped by accident or design. The ledger was the reason for silence. And whoever had hidden it had done so not recently, but long enough ago that it had settled into the dusty hollows of the piano's body, waiting like guilt for the right moment to reappear. There was no more music that evening. The vicar, visibly distressed, offered tea which no one accepted. The guests trickled out with a murmured mix of confusion and curiosity. Some would speculate that it was nothing. Some would say it was scandal. and at least one or two, Miss Marple suspected, were terrified. She left quietly, as was her way, walking with deliberate slowness past the neatly trimmed hedges of the vicarage lane. The evening was mild. The sky still bore a soft golden rim along the west. The smell of honeysuckle hung in the air. But she was not thinking about the weather. Miss Marple was thinking of Mr. Felix Hepplethwaite. She had watched him very closely as the ledger was revealed. His hands had been clasped almost too tightly. He had not reached for it, nor had he expressed outrage, and yet he had been the last to play the piano before tonight's recital. He had rehearsed the evening prior. He had had ample time and access. And the button, had that been his once? But no, that was too simple. A man clever enough to hide a ledger was unlikely to drop a button so obviously, unless he had not hidden it at all. That was the thought that stayed with her. The next morning, the village was aflame. Not literally, of course, though that might have been preferable to the slow smolder of scandal that now made its way from window boxes to bake shops. The button had made its rounds, as had the ledger. Harold Penway had not opened his shop. Mrs. Avery of the post office had allegedly fainted twice and revived only when told Miss Marple was on the case. Miss Marple herself, however, was not hurrying. She sipped her tea and studied her embroidery with the patience of someone who knew that most people eventually talked, and the wise did not need to interrupt. By 11 o'clock, her prediction was proven correct. Mrs. Marion Cresswell arrived at her door with a tray of seed scones and a tightly composed expression. "I thought you might be in need of something for Elevenses," she said. Miss Marple accepted the gift with thanks, and not a single remark on how rare it was for Marion to bring scones anywhere. Marion sat, smoothing her skirt. Her eyes were restless. Her fingers picked at the napkin in her lap. "I was wondering," she said at last, "if it's true. About the ledger, about the names in it." Miss Marple met her gaze gently. "I haven't read it thoroughly, my dear, but it does seem rather detailed." "Then he really did it," Marion said. "Felix, I mean, I always wondered." "Wondered what?" "If he'd ever paid back what he owed to Penway. There was a matter, a few years ago. He asked Harold for money, said it was for the choir's robes, but I never saw new robes, only a holiday in France." Miss Marple folded her hands. "I see. That's very helpful, Marion." "Thank you." Marion paused at the door. "You don't think anything worse will come of it, do you?" Miss Marple smiled with all the softness in the world. "Worse is a relative thing. It depends on what people are willing to admit, before they're forced to." When Marion left, Miss Marple returned to her embroidery, but the thread in her needle paused. She now had a button, a ledger, a man in debt, and a secret long enough buried that it had started to rot in the dark. The question wasn't whether it was a crime. The question was, who had known about it, and what had they done to keep it hidden? By midday, the piano at the vicarage hall had become something of a shrine. People came in quiet pairs or singly, hands behind their backs, pretending they were there to check the flowers or collect forgotten cardigans. In truth, they came to peer curiously at the little white card Constable Darnley had placed beside the instrument, reading "Do not touch police matter," as if it were a sacred relic. The hall, which had always smelled faintly of furniture polish and stale hymn books, now carried a curious tension, like something suspended in air just out of sight, ready to drop again. Miss Marple did not visit the hall, not yet. She had already seen all she needed, and she suspected that those who lingered now were not really looking for truth, but for scandal, or reassurance that they were still safely outside it. Instead, she walked the short lane behind the churchyard, her gloves neatly folded in one hand, a small basket looped over her arm. She stopped at Mrs. Temple's garden gate, not for the roses, though they were splendid, but because the Temple house faced the back side of the hall. Its parlor window, if one were observant, offered an excellent view of the delivery path and the side door, the one used not by guests, but by performers and staff. Mrs. Temple, a widow of ample warmth and modest eyesight, welcomed Miss Marple with the enthusiasm she reserved for visits that promised a good story. They took tea in the parlor beneath the ticking of a lopsided barometer. Miss Marple admired the roses, praised the fruitcake, and asked very gently if Mrs. Temple had happened to notice anything unusual on the afternoon before the recital. "Oh, I always notice things," Mrs. Temple said cheerfully. "I watch from the window when I knit. Easier on the eyes. I saw Lavinia storming in with her satchel and those dreadful gloves. And Mr. Hepplethwaite, of course. Twice. First time just after noon, then again a little before 5. Was that usual? Oh no. Normally he's only here just before it begins, but yesterday he had a parcel with him. A long thing wrapped in brown paper and string, about the length of a shoebox, but flatter." Miss Marple blinked slowly. "I see. And the second visit?" "No parcel then. But he went in the side door and came out again very quickly. Looked all a bit flustered, if you ask me. Though I dare say it might have been the wind. He's a sensitive sort." Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, very sensitive." On her walk back, she passed the mill lane. The shutters on Penway's flower shop were drawn, the brass bell removed from the hook above the door. Harold Penway had not been seen that morning, which for someone in the business of bread was very nearly an offense in itself. She paused outside the window. A newspaper lay on the inner counter, unread. A faint line of flour trailed out beneath the sill, like a silent breath. Miss Marple turned away, just as Constable Darnley came up the lane with his usual good intentions and unfortunate stride. "Miss Marple, a word, if I may." "Of course, Constable." He fell into step beside her, trying not to pant. "It's about the ledger. There's something in it that I'm not sure what to make of." She waited. "There are several payments listed to an RT over the last 8 months. Fairly large sums, always in cash. No first name, just initials. Hepplethwaite says he doesn't know who that is, but his hands were shaking when he said it." "I imagine they were," Miss Marple murmured. "Has Harold Penway responded to your inquiries?" "Not yet. No one's seen him since yesterday afternoon. There's no sign of him at the shop. I'm going to call in assistance if he doesn't turn up by tonight." "I wonder," Miss Marple said lightly, "if Harold Penway ever left the vicarage hall at all." Constable Darnley stopped short. "You mean he might have hidden himself in the building?" "I mean only that it's possible something more than a ledger was buried beneath that piano." He paled. "You think I don't know, Constable. But I do think it curious that a man like Penway, who was in debt, named in the ledger, and possibly blackmailed, should vanish the very day the object reappears." "Blackmailed?" he asked. Miss Marple tilted her head gently. "That's what it usually means when one pays regularly, and in cash under initials. And when the names in the book are all neighbors, the blackmailer must be someone familiar, someone discreet, someone trusted." The constable looked distinctly unhappy. "That's no small accusation, Miss Marple." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She left him then, flustered and unsure, but thinking, which was a start. The afternoon waned gently, sunlight drifting in golden slats across cottages and hydrangeas. But Miss Marple was already considering who else had been in that hall yesterday, who had arrived early with access to the side door, who had reason to fear what was in that book. By 4 o'clock, her suspicions received a new dimension. Mrs. Pike, the local baker's sister, arrived in a flutter, eyes round and breathless. "Miss Marple, you must come. There's something in the practice room behind the stage. The cleaner found it. Locked drawer. Smelled odd," she said. "Mr. Hepplethwaite had the key." Miss Marple rose calmly. "Of course. Let's go." The hall was dim, quiet now, its solemn hush broken only by the creak of their footsteps. The practice room had never been more than a glorified cupboard. Bare walls, upright piano, broken chair. But the drawer in question had indeed been locked, and Hepplethwaite, pale and stammering, had provided the key without protest when asked. Inside the drawer, wrapped in a handkerchief, was a bundle of something that made everyone recoil. A stained pair of gloves. Leather. Men's. Torn at the cuff and wedged beneath them, an envelope with no writing, only a smear of red wax, as though once sealed. Miss Marple touched nothing, but she noted the faint powdering of flour on the inside hem of one glove. She looked up at Hepplethwaite, whose breath was shallow. "I believe," she said gently, "you may want to sit down." The choir master did so, slumping into the broken chair, his eyes unfocused. "I didn't do anything," he whispered. "I didn't hurt him. I only kept the book because I needed to know, to be sure." "Be sure of what?" "That I wasn't the only one he had trapped." Miss Marple waited. "Penway," Hepplethwaite muttered. "He always had a ledger. Said he kept one on everyone. If we didn't pay, he'd tell. About debts, about affairs, about worse." "What was in the envelope?" Hepplethwaite shook his head. "It was already there. I never opened it. I thought if I returned the ledger, it would be over." Miss Marple turned toward the constable, who stood stiff as a fence post. "I believe," she said quietly, "this is no longer a matter of missing persons. You must search the hall from top to bottom." "And the piano?" he asked. Her eyes met his. "Especially the piano." Constable Darnley had never called for backup before. Chipping Darnley was not the kind of place that warranted it. The closest he had come was when the grocer's van collided with the parish signpost and required a second pair of hands to untangle the axle from the shrubbery. But now, with Miss Marple's quiet insistence still echoing in his ears and the gloves, those silent, stained relics of something more ominous than debt, laid out on a tea towel, he sent young Lewis from the butcher's to cycle to the station in Much Wincham and request a sergeant and a torch crew. The search of the vicarage hall began before dusk. They started with the obvious: the storeroom, the cleaning cupboard, the loft crawl space. Each door creaked open reluctantly, revealing nothing more than stacks of folding chairs, long-forgotten hymnals, and once, absurdly, a crate of dried lavender bunches labeled Flower Festival 58, but nothing that justified the sick twist in Miss Marple's stomach. She herself had stayed at the rear of the hall, seated in the third pew from the back, quietly observing. Her knitting rested untouched in her lap. She did not need movement to think, and the thoughts had begun to align themselves with terrible clarity. It was not until nearly 7 o'clock that the search turned to the piano again. Not just beneath it this time, but inside. The hall fell into a tense hush as the two young constables, assisted by a caretaker from the next parish, carefully lifted the piano's lid and examined the interior. The soundboard was dusty, the strings tarnished, the frame slightly warped by years of moisture and overuse. But toward the rear, tucked into the hollow beneath the bass, strings, they found something wedged tightly between the frame and the support beam, wrapped in oilcloth. Stiff, heavy, and unmistakably human. There was no scream, no gasps, only the sound of retreating footsteps, as if the hall itself had drawn breath and recoiled. Miss Marple stood slowly. The light had faded enough that the windows held only the reflection of the shocked faces inside, pale and still as ghosts. It took little time to confirm the identity. Harold Penway, miller, bookie, and blackmailer, had been dead for at least 24 hours. His jacket was missing a button. His collar bore a faint tear, and though his pockets had been emptied, the stitching inside one sleeve had been picked open recently, as if something small and precious had once been hidden there. Miss Marple said nothing. She merely looked at Felix Hepplethwaite, who had sunk into a chair with the expression of a man who had spent years outrunning a shadow, only to find it waiting for him by the fire. By the time Sergeant Tilbrook arrived from Much Winsham with his formal voice and leather-bound logbook, the hall had been closed, roped, and declared a crime scene. Hepplethwaite had been gently escorted to the vicar's office. The vicar himself, appalled and disoriented, offered his cellar for tea and sandwiches, though no one felt like eating. Miss Marple walked slowly home, her pace steady, her thoughts tumbling now with precision rather than speculation. The pieces had begun to arrange themselves, not in order of fact, but of motive. It was never the action that gave people away. It was the reason behind it. And in Chipping Darnley, reasons were always personal. The next morning, the village was quieter than anyone could remember. The bakery stayed shut. The usual clatter of milk crates, bicycle bells, and dogs barking at postmen was eerily absent. A soft fog had crept in across the meadows, turning the cottages into hunched silhouettes. Miss Marple received an envelope by the first post. No return address. Inside, a single calling card, unsigned, but smudged faintly with what appeared to be flour. On the back, someone had penciled, "He knew about G, what she did in 42. She stared at the handwriting a long while before setting it gently on her side table. She made no assumptions, not yet, but she recalled, with painful clarity, the wartime scandal involving a young girl, a borrowed ration book, and a soldier who vanished after a night on leave, and she remembered who had been working at the bakery then. A girl named Gwendolen, now Gwen Avery, wife of the postmaster. Pleasant, cheerful, always smiling too widely when asked about the past. Miss Marple dressed and made her way to the post office just after 10. The line was thin, and she pretended to purchase a new book of stamps, then asked quietly if Mrs. Avery might have a moment. Gwen appeared from the back room, apron dusted in sugar, her eyes slightly red-rimmed but quick to mask it. "Of course, Miss Marple. Everything all right?" "I wondered," Miss Marple said gently, "if you had heard about Harold Penway." "Oh, yes." Her voice was neutral. "Terrible. I still can't believe it. They say someone hid him in the piano. Can you imagine?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "I can." Gwen's hands stilled. A beat of silence passed. "Miss Marple," she said carefully, "I haven't spoken to Harold in years. Truly. Not since since he left me alone after I got married. He used to make little remarks about the past, about what people owed him." "I remember that time," Miss Marple said. "Many young girls had to make difficult choices. Some were brave, others were coerced. It was not always easy to tell the difference." Gwen blinked fast. "I never told anyone what he threatened me with. Not even Arthur. I was young. Foolish." "You weren't foolish, my dear. You were afraid, and rightly so." Gwen's voice broke. "He had letters. From the soldier. I didn't even know he'd kept them. He said he'd tell everyone I'd lied to the tribunal, that I'd never been engaged to the man at all, that I had made it up to get a widow's allotment." "Did you?" "No," Gwen said fiercely. "We were engaged. He died in France, but I couldn't prove it then. There was a fire at the barracks. The records were gone." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Then you have nothing to be ashamed of." "But others might not have been so lucky," Gwen whispered. "He had something on everyone. I think someone finally decided to stop him." Miss Marple left the post office with the scent of burnt sugar clinging faintly to her coat. She paused at the churchyard again. The fog had lifted, and the sun struck the spire with hard, clear light. One more piece had clicked into place. The envelope had not been a confession, nor a warning. It had been a deflection. Someone wanted her to believe the motive lay in a decades-old scandal. But the ledger had contained new names. Modern debts. The sort that whispered of marriages strained by secrets or affairs conducted too carelessly. She turned back toward the high street. It was time to visit Lavinia Marsh. Not because Lavinia was dangerous, but because Lavinia knew everything, and knowledge, when mishandled, was sometimes deadlier than any weapon. Lavinia Marsh answered her door in a pressed blouse, lipstick immaculately applied, and an expression that hovered somewhere between curiosity and disdain, her natural resting state. Miss Marple, unfazed, offered a pleasant smile and a modest request. "If you're not too busy, my dear, I should be very grateful for a few minutes. There's something I'd like to ask you. About Harold Penway." Lavinia stepped aside with the air of one granting an audience rather than welcoming a guest. "I suppose you must," she said crisply. "Everyone else in the village seems to think you're doing the constable's work for him." Miss Marple chuckled politely. "Oh, goodness, no. I only observe, you know. That's the privilege of being old and idle. People forget one is present." Said Lavinia, leading the way into a sitting room with a view of the lane and the vicarage roof. "They do, often to their peril." The room was neat, dry, and suffused with the scent of lavender wax and ironed linen. On the table sat a folder of committee notes for the harvest fete, and a pair of half-spectacles folded precisely atop them. Miss Marple seated herself with quiet grace and waited until Lavinia had poured tea and fussed with a doily before speaking again. "I imagine you've known Harold Penway longer than most," she said softly. "You grew up in Chipping Darnley together, didn't you?" Lavinia gave a short laugh. "I knew him well enough to know I didn't like him. Oh, he was clever, yes. But clever in that nasty, ferreting sort of way. He always knew the thing to say that would make someone uncomfortable. As a child, he pulled wings off butterflies. As a man, he pulled secrets out of people and used them like stones in his pocket." "That's quite an image," said Miss Marple gently. "It's quite true," said Lavinia, her mouth tight. "Do you know he once told poor Mrs. Holcomb that her late husband had owed him £20 for timber, and if she didn't settle the debt, he'd speak to the solicitor about some missing receipts. She paid him, of course. Later, she found the original bill. There was no debt. He made her cry in the street." Miss Marple nodded, folding her gloved hands. "Did you know about the ledger?" "I suspected. He carried something heavy when he came to the hall, one of those old ledgers from his father's shop, I thought. But then he asked to borrow the piano stool key, said he needed to check for infestation. He said it in front of the curate's wife, too. Bold as brass. Of course, I said no." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "That was before the recital?" Lavinia looked faintly offended. "Naturally. I wouldn't have given him a key during a public event. Hepplethwaite might have, though. I wouldn't put it past him. The man's always had an air of desperation about him. That twitchy sincerity, it covers guilt, in my view. Did you notice anything unusual that afternoon?" "Only that Penway didn't stay to hear the music. He left through the side door half an hour before the recital started. I saw him from the vestry. Looked rather hurried now I think of it. I assumed he was avoiding someone. He always was." Miss Marple sipped her tea in silence, letting the stillness speak. Lavinia eventually sighed and leaned forward. "Look, Jane, if that man ended up dead, I can't say I'm sorry. But I didn't kill him. And if you're asking whether I knew someone who might, well, everyone had a reason. But most people also had something to lose. Lose. That's the real key. Find the person who no longer had anything left to lose. And there you have it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "That's a very good observation, Lavinia. You always did have a keen mind for sorting the wheat from the chaff." Lavinia sniffed. "It's a pity the police rarely do." On her way out, Miss Marple paused briefly by the rose trellis and glanced down the lane. The fog had lifted entirely now, and the world was sharp with clarity. The church spire rose like a pale needle over the village rooftops. She stood there a moment longer than necessary, watching two young girls skip past the bakery, one of them carrying a folded note. The envelope from earlier returned to her mind. Who had written it? And why mention Gwen if not to confuse the path? As she passed the vicarage wall, she found herself slowing. The doors were locked, but the side gate to the hall's back garden stood ajar. She stepped through it quietly. A group of constables had cleared out most of the stage equipment the night before, and the piano, now a grim centerpiece, had been moved to one side, draped with canvas. The silence inside was heavier now. Not grief, but expectation. She approached the practice room door again and stood still. The drawer had held gloves, a letter, and something else. A scent. She had not missed it. Soap. A particular kind. The faint smell of lavender with a sharp, metallic tang beneath it. Not a man's scent. A woman's. She stepped back and turned slowly. The vicar's wife, Margaret Pemble, stood just behind her, startled but composed. Her hands were clasped tightly at her waist. "Oh," she said softly. "I didn't hear you come in." Miss Marple nodded, not smiling. "I might say the same, Margaret." There was a long pause between them. The vicar's wife was a quiet woman, unfailingly kind, though often absent-minded. She taught Sunday school and arranged flowers in the church, but she had not been at the recital. She had left early. Headache, someone had said. Miss Marple studied her face. Pale, drawn, but dry-eyed. "You were here yesterday afternoon, weren't you?" she asked gently. "Before the recital?" Margaret's mouth parted, then closed again. Yes, for just a moment. I had left my handbag in the vestry. I came in through the side and saw Harold Penway." A pause. Then, "Yes. Did you speak?" Another pause. Margaret looked at the piano. "He said something vile. About my son. About how he'd found out things. I asked him to leave." He laughed. "Said if I wanted the letters back, I'd have to give him something. He pulled them out, waved them at me." Miss Marple said nothing. "I don't remember," Margaret whispered. "I truly don't. I was so angry. And then, later, I was in the garden. I thought I'd only dreamed it, until I saw the piano was moved, and then I knew." "You found the letters later?" Margaret nodded, slowly. "In the pocket of his coat. I burned them. I thought if no one else ever saw them, maybe we could be safe again." Miss Marple placed a hand lightly on her arm. "Margaret, I don't believe you killed him. But someone did. And someone used your fear to hide what they had done." Margaret's eyes filled. "Then who?" "That," Miss Marple said quietly, "is what I intend to find out next. But I believe the answer lies not in who was most afraid, but in who profited most from Penway's silence." She left the hall with a slow certainty in her step. The web was tightening. Someone had planted the ledger to implicate one person, pointed suspicion toward another, and hidden the body somewhere it was guaranteed to be found. It was a performance, and it had one last act to play. By the time Miss Marple returned home, the village clock was striking 4, and the sun hung at a slant in the sky, casting long, slatted shadows across the hedgerows. She moved through her sitting room without removing her gloves, walked straight to the bureau beneath the window, and opened the drawer where she kept the small notebook rarely seen by anyone. It was a neat ledger of her own, though far less ominous than Harold Penway's. Within it, she listed not debts or threats, but something more valuable. Moments. Moments when voices caught. When someone said too little or too much. When someone offered help too quickly. When a face changed in just the wrong place. She recorded without fanfare the odd angles of human behavior that so often told the story long before the facts arrived. She added a few more lines now. Lavinia saw Penway leave at 4:30. Hepplethwaite seen with a parcel, no longer had it later. Envelope rare. Gwen likely planted. Margaret frightened, not guilty. Button dropped or staged. And then, beneath that, who knew the piano would be moved? That was the key. That was what had whispered to her since the moment they found the body. The choice of hiding place had not been random. It had been calculated not only to conceal the body, but to ensure it was found at a time and in a setting that maximized drama. If the piano hadn't rattled, if Celia hadn't faltered, the button had been a trigger, not an accident. Miss Marple turned the page and wrote only 2 initials, RT, the same that appeared in Harold Penway's ledger, next to sums in neat, increasing increments, the months between them, and no further explanation. Hepplethwaite had claimed ignorance. Gwen Avery had suggested misdirection. Lavinia had dismissed it altogether, but one person hadn't been asked. And one person had been, quite suddenly, absent. Roderick Trent, Rosamond's brother, rarely in the village but known well enough, a solicitor's assistant in Eastbourne. Returned for the recital, staying at his sister's cottage for the weekend only. Handsome in a nervous way, quick with compliments, quick to vanish too after the Ichi body was discovered, reportedly called away to tend to a case, according to Rosamond. Miss Marple rose, buttoned her coat, and stepped outside once more. She found Rosamond Trent in her front garden, pruning a climbing clematis with unnecessary vigor. The younger woman wore the kind of hat favored by people who believed themselves a touch more worldly than they were, and her eyes brightened with false composure when she saw Miss Marple. "Oh, Miss Marple, what a shock this all is, isn't it?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Terrible, indeed. Such a fright for the village, and so unexpected." "Yes, yes," Rosamond nodded, snipping at a blossom that had done her no wrong. "I do hope the police will be discreet. These things have a way of sticking to people's reputations, deserved or not." "Quite," Miss Marple agreed. "Is your brother still staying with you?" Rosamond hesitated by half a second, just enough to confirm Miss Marple's suspicion. "Oh no," she said brightly. "He left just yesterday morning, early train. He'd only come to support the recital, you know. Very fond of music." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "And of games too, I imagine." Rosamond blinked. "Games? Poker, perhaps. Or whist. He's always struck me as someone who reads expressions more than he listens to words." Rosamond gave a brittle laugh. "Oh, well, I suppose. Roderick does enjoy his little amusements, but he's dreadfully dull when it comes to money matters. Always counting things twice." Miss Marple stepped closer to the hedge. "You know, it's very strange, isn't it, that Harold Penway, who kept such precise records, should refer to someone only by initials, unless, of course, he was protecting that person, or afraid of what might happen if the name were made explicit." Rosamond's clippers paused. "You mean he was being blackmailed himself?" "Number, I think Harold was always the blackmailer, but I think someone turned the tables. Someone who paid him, yes, but not because they were weak, because they were waiting for the moment he overreached." Rosamond's jaw tightened. "Are you accusing my brother?" "Not at all," said Miss Marple calmly. "But I do wonder if he had a hand in moving the piano, or if he merely knew that a performance was the safest place for a discovery." Rosamond opened her mouth, closed it again, and then said very softly, "Roderick always said Harold was dangerous, that one day someone would push too far. That blackmail isn't just a crime, it's a slow kind of murder." Miss Marple said nothing. "And if Roderick did, well, something," Rosamond whispered, "wouldn't it matter what for? To protect someone else, to stop it continuing?" Miss Marple looked at her gently. "Intent matters, but so does method. Harold Penway didn't die in a struggle. He was suffocated. No signs of a fight. He likely trusted the person who got that close." Rosamond's hand dropped from the hedge. Her voice, when it came, was very low. "You think it was me? I think Harold was a danger to more than one person. I think someone dropped that button on purpose. I think someone wanted the body to be found publicly, but not immediately. Just long enough for everyone to suspect someone else. The ledger, the envelope, all carefully arranged, almost like a stage." Rosamond was still. Miss Marple stepped back. "I'll be speaking with Constable Darnley this evening, but I thought it fair to offer you the chance first to say what you know, or what you did." "I didn't kill him," Rosamond said suddenly. "But I did help move him. Roderick called me, after he found Harold like that. Said it had gone wrong, that Harold had slipped, hit his head, but I saw the marks. I knew he was already gone. Roderick panicked. I told him what to do, where to put the body, how to make it look distant. Someone else's crime. He left that night. I thought it would fade." Miss Marple's expression didn't change. "But guilt rarely does." "I didn't mean for it to go this far. It always does," said Miss Marple softly. "When the truth is delayed." Rosamond stood frozen among her flowers, the clematis petals fallen in a quiet ring around her boots. Miss Marple turned and walked away, her steps measured, her hands folded. The air was growing cooler now, the sun slipping west. She would speak to the constable that evening, and she would give him all he needed: the button's placement, the timing of the recital, the sighting by Mrs. Temple, and the confession, partial but enough. She had no malice in it, only understanding. Some murders happened in fury, others in fear, but this one, she thought, had been written like music, and the final note had just been played. The dusk that settled over Chipping Darnley brought with it a wind that carried the scent of turned earth and wood smoke, the kind of quiet that often came before rain and after revelation. Miss Marple, seated in her parlor beside a modest fire, stirred her tea only once before setting the spoon aside. She no longer needed it to steady her thoughts. The last pieces had begun to fall into place, not with a crash, but with a hush. She had always believed that the difference between truth and lies was often only the tone in which they were told. Rosamond Trent's confession had not struck her as wholly false, but it had not rung entirely true either. There had been hesitation, yes, but not fear. Guilt, perhaps, but not the kind that trembled, the kind that calculated. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward and removed her notebook again, now heavy with the quiet weight of accumulated observation. She reviewed her final entries with the same attention a musician might give a final chord. Soft, but precise. Roderick arrived Friday, departed early Sunday. Rosamond present at time of body discovery. Rosamond knew where to hide body for theatrical reveal. Harold likely suffocated, not struck. No real panic observed in either sibling. Intentional misdirection. Envelope, Yara Gwen. Button placement, too perfect. And then one last line. Motive still unclear, or too carefully disguised. She sat back in her chair. It was true, as Rosamond claimed, that Harold Penway was a danger to many. But murder, even of a man like Harold, was rarely carried out from a single motive. It was rarely clean. And something about Rosamond's story was far too tidy, too prepared. The knock came just after 8. Constable Darnley stood on her step, damp hair flattened by the mist, his eyes unsure. "Miss Marple, I thought I ought to speak with you before I write my report for the sergeant. I've had a word with Miss Trent." Miss Marple stepped aside to let him in, and he lowered himself cautiously into the armchair as if it might ask questions of its own. "She told me about her brother, said he panicked, said she helped move the body, that he left everything to her. Seemed sincere." Miss Marple nodded. "She's quite capable of seeming so." Darnley frowned. "You don't believe her?" "I believe she had something to do with it, but not in the way she said, and certainly not alone." The constable looked down at his notebook, uncertain. "It's already a mess. The ledger, the gloves, the button. It's hard to see what matters and what was planted." "That's precisely the point," Miss Marple said, setting down her tea. "What if all of it was staged, not only to confuse us, but to distract us from the one thing that wasn't manipulated?" Constable Darnley stared. "The body? Number, the piano." He blinked again. "I don't follow." "Think about it, Constable. Why the piano? Why choose to hide a body in the one object guaranteed to be the center of attention at a recital? It wasn't simply convenience. It was symbolism, performance, a crime of composition. Darnley still looked puzzled. Who in the village, Miss Marple continued gently, is most accustomed to orchestrating performances? To calculating what people will see, what they will hear, and when? Understanding began to dawn in his face. You don't mean I do. The following morning broke grey and sullen, the sky pressing low over the rooftops like a held breath. Miss Marple, dressed with deliberate care, hat, gloves, brooch, and set out for the vicarage, where the hall remained cordoned off. But she did not head toward the stage. Instead, she turned to the vestry door and knocked firmly. Mr. Felix Hepplethwaite answered, his eyes red-rimmed, collar slightly askew. He had aged a decade in the last 3 days, and his voice, when he spoke, was papery. "Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting visitors." "No," she said kindly, "but you were expecting this moment. May I come in?" He stepped aside. The vestry was narrow and cluttered, filled with hymnals, broken coat hooks, and the faint scent of mildew. A kettle steamed faintly on a windowsill. Hepplethwaite gestured toward a chair, and Miss Marple sat with the composure of a woman preparing to conduct, not accuse. "I believe," she said softly, "that it was you who killed Harold Penway." He flinched. "I believe," she continued, "that it wasn't out of panic or even hatred, but necessity. Not just to stop his threats, but because you were already too far entangled to let him live, and because you saw a way to hide it in plain sight, with music of all things." Hepplethwaite swallowed hard. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that. But you planned it." His hands shook. "He came to me Thursday evening, said he had proof, letters, a photo, things from years ago, from when I was just starting out, things that would ruin me. Not legally, socially, the committee, the parish council. He said I'd never conduct again, that they'd strip me of everything." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "What did he ask for?" "Control," he whispered. "Over the recital program, over the choir. He wanted to appear in it again, be praised, redeemed in public. Said if I gave him that, he'd consider destroying the evidence. But you didn't trust him." "I knew he wouldn't stop. He enjoyed it too much. He kept the ledger in the piano stool during rehearsals. Told me he liked knowing it was there, that it made him feel powerful." "So you made a different plan." "I didn't plan to kill him," Hepplethwaite said miserably. "But I planned everything else. I arranged to meet him early at the hall, told him I had money. I didn't. I had gloves. I'd taken the key to the practice room and laid out the cloth. I don't remember what I said, only that he laughed, and I pressed the cloth over his mouth." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "And then I panicked, truly. But when I opened the piano and saw how hollow the frame was, it just fit. I was going to tell the vicar. I was. But then Rosamond came in, early for rehearsal. She saw the cloth, the look on my face. She knew. She helped you move the body." "Yes." She never asked why. She just said we had to make it look like someone else had done it. She brought the button from an old coat and told me where to drop it. She even suggested the envelope to draw suspicion elsewhere. She said no one would suspect me if I looked terrified. And the ledger. I left it where it would be found. I thought, perhaps if people saw how many he hurt, they'd understand." Miss Marple sat still for a long time. Then, finally, she said, "You must come with me, Mr. Hepplethwaite, and tell Constable Darnley exactly what you've told me." He looked up, broken but grateful. "Will they understand?" "Perhaps not all of them," Miss Marple said gently. "But the truth has always had a strange way of surviving scandal, even in a village." Outside, the wind stirred through the yew trees beside the church. The bells did not ring, But somewhere in the hush, a chord had resolved, and Miss Marple, rising slowly, knew the last refrain was near. Constable Darnley took the confession with both hands, clasped tightly around his pencil, as if he feared the words might slip away before he could fix them to the page. Hepplethwaite sat across from him in the vicar's office, a man diminished, face drawn, fingers trembling, but calm in a way that only comes when a long-dreaded truth is finally spoken aloud. Miss Marple remained silent throughout the process, her chair drawn just enough back to remain outside the glare of the oil lamp. She did not interrupt. She did not clarify. She only listened, her gaze soft but steady, like a lamp in a window on a dark night. When Hepplethwaite finished, there was a long pause. Darnley looked up slowly. "You understand what you've just admitted, Mr. Hepplethwaite?" "Yes," he said quietly. "I do. You understand this will have consequences." "I rather expect it will," the choir master said, with a faint, bitter smile. "But not worse than the ones I've lived with these past days, or the ones I've feared for years." Darnley nodded, then looked at Miss Marple. "And Miss Trent's part in all this?" Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice low and precise. "She didn't kill Harold Penway, Constable, but she did help conceal the body, and she manipulated the scene to shift suspicion onto others. That, I think, you'll find falls under obstruction of justice." The young constable exhaled, rubbing his brow with the side of his hand. This wasn't in any of the books at training, not with pianos and buttons and recitals. "No," Miss Marple agreed gently. "And it won't be in the papers either, if the vicar has anything to say about it. There's a certain type of disgrace that a parish prefers to keep quiet, and a certain kind of man who will carry that disgrace with quiet dignity. Hepplethwaite didn't act out of greed or hatred, Constable. He acted because he believed there was no way out. Does that excuse it?" "No," she said, "but it explains it." By midday, Sergeant Tilbrook had arrived, summoned by Darnley's urgent note. He took the confession down a second time, this time with polished shoes and a quieter pen, nodding solemnly at every phrase. He asked no unnecessary questions. He looked at the ledger only once. He did not touch the gloves. Hepplethwaite left quietly, escorted not in handcuffs, but in a long grey coat. The vicar did not speak to him as he passed, nor did the choir boys, who watched from behind the vestry door, but Miss Marple did. Just one sentence, as he reached the step. "You did compose the ending, Mr. Hepplethwaite. You chose the key." He nodded once, his face unreadable, then vanished around the corner with the constable. The village reacted as it always did, with brisk denial, then whispered elaboration, then a kind of slow, creeping amnesia. By the following Sunday, the church bulletin made no mention of the affair, and the piano had been quietly removed for urgent restoration. Rosamond Trent was not seen for 3 days. When she returned, she was thinner and paler, but dressed perfectly as always, and she declined to discuss the matter even with Lavinia Marsh, which was, in chipping Darnley, the final word on anything. Miss Marple received 3 separate letters that week, one anonymous, praising her moral clarity, one from Gwen Avery, enclosing a small handkerchief with violet embroidery and a quiet thank you, and one from Margaret Pemble, the vicar's wife, inviting her for tea with no mention of Harold Penway or ledgers or gloves. Miss Marple declined the first and last, but replied to Gwen in neat, careful script. "Sometimes silence is not shame. It is survival. You have nothing to repay, but something to live for. Do so, and do so freely." She signed it only with her initials. In the calm that followed, the village began to settle again, like flour after a gust of wind. But Miss Marple remained inwardly alert. There were always ripples, even in the stillest pond. Crimes such as this, born of fear, tangled with manipulation, left shadows. She kept thinking of the moment she had first heard the button fall, that single, strange thud in the middle of Debussy. It had struck her not as a mistake, but as a signal, and in the end, that was exactly what it had been. A carefully timed note in a performance composed to deceive. What lingered now was not outrage or pity, but an understanding deeper than either. For the crime had not been born in a single moment, but over years, years of small decisions, of things unspoken, of corners cut and truths hidden and debts accumulated in quiet. And the true weapon, Miss Marple thought, had not been the cloth or the gloves. It had been shame, the kind that isolates, the kind that convinces a man that exposure is worse than guilt, that the only way to preserve one's dignity is to bury the past beneath something heavy and make it sing. But shame was not always silent. Sometimes it dropped a button. Sometimes it knocked the lid of a piano just so. Sometimes it walked into a vicarage with trembling hands and asked, finally, to be heard. On the second Saturday after the arrest, there was a small gathering at the vicarage hall. Not a recital, but a quiet service for reflection and renewal. The piano had been removed, the chairs arranged in a soft semicircle. The vicar, subdued and grey-faced, spoke briefly about forgiveness. No one mentioned names. Miss Marple sat near the back as she always did and watched the villagers bow their heads. Some truly prayed. Some merely passed the time. But a few, those who had read their names in that ledger and wept in private, clutched their hymnals a little tighter. When the service ended, Miss Marple did not linger. She stepped out into the cooling air and walked home with the slow contentment of someone who had seen justice done, if not loudly, then precisely. Her footsteps made no noise on the lane. The sky above her was pale and wide, scattered with birds heading east. Inside her sitting room, she set her gloves on the table and lit the lamp. There was one more note to make in her ledger. Case closed. But just beneath it, in her smallest handwriting, she added something else. Human nature is rarely evil, but it is often afraid. And in fear, people do things even music cannot disguise. The following Monday dawned clear and still, the kind of morning Chipping Darnley considered a gift. Sunlight caught on dew-soaked ivy, the baker's shutters lifting with a familiar creak, and the postman already whistling as he cycled past the churchyard wall. To the casual observer, the village looked unchanged, as if the scandal of Harold Penway's death had slipped away like a bad dream. But Miss Marple, sipping her tea near the parlor window, knew better. Nothing in the village truly vanished. It merely sank beneath the surface, and sometimes, when it rose again, it brought things with it. She turned the final page of the local paper, set it aside, and reached for her knitting, not for comfort, but to think. Her fingers moved automatically, but her mind was still circling one unresolved thread. It had not come to her with the usual clarity of a late-night reflection or a memory jogged by gossip. Rather, it had arrived unbidden the evening before, during the final hymn at the vicarage's quiet reflection service. It was a glance, just a glance, passed between Rosamond Trent and Lavinia Marsh. Not long, not dramatic, perhaps a second too swift for anyone else to notice. But Miss Marple had, and that one glance shifted everything. Because it had not been the look of shared grief or solidarity or even mutual suspicion. It had been collusion, and that meant she had made a mistake. Not in identifying the act, but in identifying the composer of the performance. The doorbell rang just as she dropped a stitch. She rose, composed herself, and opened it to find Lavinia Marsh standing primly on the step, a parcel in hand, her expression unusually unreadable. "Miss Marple," she said with a thin smile, "I hope I'm not intruding. I found this old program from the recital tucked in the back of my desk drawer. I thought you might like it for your collection." Miss Marple accepted it graciously, glancing at the date. "How kind, Lavinia. I do try to keep a record of such events. Music tends to drift from memory otherwise." "So do certain truths," Lavinia replied, her smile still fixed. "May I come in?" "Of course." They sat in the parlor, tea already warm in the pot, and for a few minutes they spoke of small things: hydrangeas, a possible new curate, the unfortunate decline of church linen. But Miss Marple was no longer listening with half an ear. She was watching, carefully. Lavinia's hands never trembled, her voice never faltered. But she was too still, too perfect. And when Miss Marple asked if she had ever spoken to Harold Penway privately, Lavinia's spoon clinked gently against the china as she stirred. "Only once. He tried to involve me in some scheme or other, a project with the parish hall funds. Said he could redirect a portion for the choir's benefit. I declined, of course. I said if he persisted, I'd take it to the vicar." "And did he?" "No," she said, placing the spoon down. "He moved on to someone easier. He always did." "You didn't think to warn the others?" Lavinia looked up then, her eyes sharp. "Do you really think warning would have stopped him?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Perhaps not." They spoke no further of Harold, but when Lavinia rose to leave, Miss Marple escorted her only as far as the hallway, and as the door clicked shut behind her, the final puzzle piece slipped quietly into place. Miss Marple turned the program over. On the back, in the top corner, was a faint pencil notation. Second movement, drop. It was Lavinia's handwriting, not Hepplethwaite's. The button had been her idea. Miss Marple sat down slowly. She had not been wrong about Hepplethwaite's guilt, but she had been wrong about who guided his confession, his collapse, his timing. Lavinia Marsh, quiet, unmarried, exacting, had conducted the entire cover-up. Rosamond Trent had not manipulated Hepplethwaite to protect her brother. She had helped Lavinia ensure the body would be found in a public, poetic fashion. They had worked together, not out of shared guilt, but shared purpose. Because Lavinia had more at stake than anyone. Not blackmail, not shame, power. Harold Penway had threatened to expose something far older, far more dangerous than gossip. He had discovered that Lavinia had been quietly moving funds, committee contributions, choir donations, even a portion of the Harvest Fete revenue, into a private account. She had been clever, meticulous. But Harold had, at some point, stumbled across her secret and written her name into the ledger. Not as a debtor, but as a recipient. RT had been the red herring. Rosamond Trent the useful distraction. Lavinia had arranged it all, and Hepplethwaite, terrified of exposure, half blind with guilt, had been her pawn. Miss Marple stood, returned to her desk, and opened her notebook for the last time. She did not write an accusation. She wrote a question. Does justice lie in truth alone or in what the truth prevents? Because turning Lavinia in would not undo what had happened. It would merely pull apart the seams of the village a little further. And she suspected that Hepplethwaite would not survive a second exposure. Nor would Margaret Pemble, nor Gwen Avery, nor half a dozen others who had, in fear or silence, enabled the village to continue spinning on its quiet, worn axis. Miss Marple looked toward the garden, where a robin had landed on the sundial. The world, as ever, tilted gently forward. She folded the notebook closed. Later that evening, at precisely 7:30, Miss Marple returned the recital program to the envelope in which it had come, sealed it with tape, and wrote a short note. Your performance was masterful. Do take care never to conduct again. She signed it with her initials, placed it in the post addressed to Miss L. Marsh, and went to prepare her supper. Outside, the village of Chipping Darnley began to breathe again, quiet, crooked, and as delicate as lace laid over secrets. And Miss Marple, seated with her boiled egg and buttered toast, found herself neither pleased nor triumphant, but calm. Because not all endings were clean. Some, like the final chord of an unfinished symphony, were simply allowed to fade. A week passed. The rhythm of the village began, in its cautious way, to reassert itself. Children kicked balls against garden walls again, the bakery reopened with cautious buns, and the vicar's Sunday sermon returned to topics less incendiary than forgiveness. Chipping Darnley, ever polite, did what it had always done best: quietly choose not to look too hard at what it couldn't bear to fully know. But Miss Marple watched everything. She noticed, for instance, how Lavinia Marsh had resumed her place at the head of the parish beautification committee, as though no whispers lingered behind her. She noticed how Rosamond Trent, no longer flitting from shop to shop in her bright hats, walked with her chin slightly lowered and her skirts plain. She noticed how Constable Darnley, though outwardly cheerful, had begun visiting the churchyard more often, where he stood at Harold Penway's newly installed stone with a look that wasn't quite mourning. The villagers would not speak of it. Not directly. Not yet. But Miss Marple, in her quiet armchair by the window, began to feel the tension unspool, strand by strand, like a badly tied knot gradually coming undone. It was not relief exactly. More like exhaustion, or perhaps surrender. What remained now was memory. And memory, Miss Marple knew, had a tendency to rewrite itself when left unchallenged. People forget details. They misplace malice. They revise guilt. In time, Harold Penway would be remembered not as a blackmailer or a bully, but merely as that poor man with all those secrets. And Heplithwaite, if he was remembered at all, would be referred to in hushed tones, like someone who had once been caught in a storm and never quite dried out. But Miss Marple did not forget. She remembered the sound of the button striking the floor. She remembered the red wax seal. She remembered Gwen Avery's shaking hands and Lavinia's falsely concerned eyes. She remembered the weight in Heplithwaite's voice, not the weight of confession, but of manipulation. And she remembered, with cold clarity, that not one person, not the vicar, not the police, not even Rosamond, had asked what happened to the rest of the ledger, because it hadn't all been found. She was quite certain of that now. The version that surfaced had been curated, neatly bound, carefully sorted, with just enough scandal to stir distraction and just enough ambiguity to shield those who most needed shielding. The entries had been real, yes, but some were conspicuously absent, and the timing of its discovery had been too precise. Lavinia had planned it, yes, but she hadn't done it alone, which brought Miss Marple, this fine Thursday morning, to a decision. She stood, took up her handbag, and made her way down the lane to the post office. Inside, Gwen Avery was alone behind the counter, weighing a stack of envelopes with her usual mechanical cheerfulness. She looked up with a startled smile when she saw Miss Marple. "Oh, good morning. It's early still. We haven't had the second post yet." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "I'm not here for letters today, my dear. Only for a little chat. If you've a moment." Gwen hesitated, glanced behind her as though expecting someone to appear, then nodded. "Of course. I'll just step into the back." She led Miss Marple through the small beaded curtain and into the sorting room, a cramped space of labeled cubbyholes and rustling paper. There was only one stool, which Gwen offered instinctively. Miss Marple remained standing. "I wanted to thank you for your note," she said gently, "and for the handkerchief. It was very thoughtful." Gwen flushed slightly. "I didn't know if I should say anything. I just, after everything..." "Quite." Miss Marple let the pause linger, then added, It must have been difficult, knowing what Harold kept in that ledger." Gwen looked down at her hands. "I imagine you weren't the only one who feared what might happen if it was made public." Her breath caught. "I never saw it, not properly. Only once, when he left it on the table and went to the door, but I recognized names. Names that didn't appear in the version the police found." Gwen looked up sharply. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft. "Did you remove the pages, or did someone else?" There was a long, frozen silence. Then Gwen said, so quietly Miss Marple had to lean in to hear. I gave them to Lavinia. How many? 5, maybe 6 pages. The oldest ones, from before the war. I didn't read them all, only enough to know it was worse than I thought. And Lavinia, she burned them, or so she said. She told me it was the only way to protect the village, to keep people from tearing each other apart. She said Harold had wanted to ruin everyone because he couldn't belong. She said she was keeping us safe. Miss Marple nodded. It was exactly what Lavinia would say, and in her own mind, it would be true. Gwen's hands trembled in her lap. Did I do wrong? Miss Marple reached out and patted her arm gently. You did what you could with what you had. Sometimes that's all any of us can do. But she used me. Yes, Miss Marple said calmly. She did. When she returned home, the air had grown warmer, and the robins had begun gathering twigs again near the church's eaves. Miss Marple placed her handbag on the hall table and stood a moment, very still. The murder had been solved. The killer had confessed. The village had resumed its tidy routine. And yet, something deeper had been left unresolved. Lavinia Marsh remained at large. Not legally guilty, perhaps. Not the one who had pressed the cloth over Harold Penway's mouth, but the architect of its concealment, the voice behind the manipulation, the editor of a truth she had no right to rewrite. Miss Marple had no intention of reopening the case with the police. She had seen what such things did to villages, but she would not forget. She would not let Lavinia forget either. That afternoon, she penned a final note. It was short, deliberately ambiguous, written on crisp paper with the clean, firm hand of someone who never needed to raise her voice to be heard. The truth has many hands. I imagine 1 or 2 may still be holding matches. Do be careful. She left it unsigned. She posted it herself. As the envelope slipped into the postbox slot with a quiet click, Miss Marple turned, her step steady, her eyes calm. There would be no final confrontation, no scandal, no arrest, only the knowledge, now sealed and delivered, that someone else still remembered, and that, for people like Lavinia Marsh, was often far more frightening than any sentence a court could hand down. The truth, Miss Marple knew, did not always need to shout. Sometimes it only needed to knock. Once. And be heard. The garden at St. Swithin's was unusually still the following Sunday, save for the faint whisper of petals falling from the apple tree near the vestry door. Miss Marple stood beside the stone bench under the climbing rose, unchanged as ever by the stirrings of scandal or storm. The sun filtered softly through the branches, and a distant lark gave the only sign that the world continued turning. She had not come to speak. She had come to wait. At precisely 4:15, Lavinia Marsh rounded the hedged path, hat set at its usual angle, gloves folded in her left hand, her right clutching the note Miss Marple had sent days ago. She did not offer her usual brittle smile. "You asked me not to come to the house," Lavinia said, her voice cool. "So I assumed this was where you meant to meet me." Miss Marple nodded. "Thank you for coming." There was a silence. Birds chirped beyond the church wall. "I should like to know," Lavinia said, "whether you intend to go to the authorities." "No," said Miss Marple simply. "Not unless there is further reason to." Lavinia's mouth tightened. "Then what do you want, Jane?" Miss Marple regarded her a moment. "To see what you look like when you realize you didn't win." A faint flicker passed through Lavinia's eyes, almost imperceptible, but not to Miss Marple. "You buried Harold Penway's blackmail under a mask of civic duty," she said gently. "You orchestrated his discovery with timing more suited to a theater than a parish hall. And you let a man you considered weak take the fall, believing, perhaps, that guilt suited him better than disgrace suited you. Hepplethwaite was guilty. Yes, but you made him useful, just as you did Gwen and Rosamond, and even the poor vicar's wife. You know, Lavinia, People always say you can't commit murder with tea and flower shows, but you've proved that one can come quite close. Lavinia's voice remained composed. I did what was necessary. You did what was convenient, Miss Marple corrected her. And clever. But cleverness doesn't make a person good. Only very good at not being caught. There was a long pause between them. You said you wouldn't go to the police. And I won't, Miss Marple said. Because I'm not trying to punish you. I'm trying to name you. Because I want you to live every day with the knowledge that someone saw what you did. Truly saw it and didn't look away. Lavinia drew herself up as if for committee duty. And what do you expect me to do? Resign from the choir board? Retire from the fete? No, Miss Marple said softly. I expect you to go on, to walk through this village knowing that your power no longer comes from silence, but from what you did when you believed no one was watching. Lavinia's throat worked once, then she turned. Miss Marple did not stop her. She watched her walk away, not broken, but changed, in the way that only someone who's been seen without their mask can be changed. Later that evening, Miss Marple returned to her writing desk. The notebook was closed for good now, the case recorded, resolved, and put away. There would be no justice in the way the newspapers printed it, and no glory to recount. But there was truth, and sometimes that was all a quiet village ever needed. She picked up her pen and wrote one last line, just below her final entry. Evil is rarely loud, but it always leaves a trace. Then she folded the notebook, set it in the drawer, and reached for her teacup. Outside, the roses were beginning to bloom again, and inside, Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest smile. Not of satisfaction, but of certainty, 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 but of certainty.